Okay, in the previous segment we had seen that the Gemara had suggested that a kav in Arba Amos is considered scattered. So the Gemara now is going to analyze that question. Eichidami. What exactly is the case? When does it make sense to decide if one can keep the grain or not based on kav b'arba amos, of how scattered it is? Because if it was derech nefila, if it looks like it was thrown, then even if you find a lot of grain, you should keep it, because if it's thrown, that means that the owner threw it away. He doesn't want it. He doesn't care about it. So no matter how much grain there is, you should be able to keep it. But on the other hand, said the Gemara, but if the grain that you found was neatly placed, then any amount of grain, no matter how small the amount is, you should have to announce it, because the fact that it was placed neatly shows that he intends to come back. So now comes the Gemara and says, Amar Rav Ukba bar Chama. Rav Ukba bar Chama says, B'mechenashta debei dari askinan. The Mishnah is referring to a case where the finder found the leftovers in a threshing place. Meaning, a threshing place, as we saw before, is a place where farmers come to process the grain, to extract the kernels from the chaff of the grain, of the wheat, and they are working quickly. As they pay money for the use of the threshing place, they want to use the time efficiently, and therefore they rush, meaning they don't stop to put the grain down nicely, they throw it. But throwing it doesn't mean that they don't want it, they throw it because they're in a rush. So if you find the leftovers in such a place, then says Rav Ukba, that's why it makes sense to do the following. Kav be'arba amos, if the amount of grain that you found is a kav that is scattered in an area of 4 by 4 amos, the nafish tirchayu, there's a lot of work involved in picking up the grain in such an area. Lo tarach inish, a person will not put the effort, he will not bother himself. Velo adar ati, he will not return. Veshakilehu, to take the grain. Afkure mefkar lehu, therefore the grain becomes ownerless, and therefore the finder can keep it. But betzir me'achi, if the finder found a small, an amount of grain spread in a smaller area, less than 4 by 4 amos, then you can assume tarach, that the owner will put the effort, the adar, he will return, ati, he will come, veshakilehu, and take the grain, velo mafker lehu, and therefore it doesn't become hefker. So therefore, in a threshing place, it makes sense to use the rule of kav b'arba amos. We cannot use the rule of is it thrown or placed, because all the grain is thrown there. But thrown in this case doesn't indicate that the owner doesn't want it. As we mentioned before, it's thrown because the farmer is rushing. So therefore, we have to use a different rule, which is kav b'arba amos. One kav in 4 by 4 amos tells us, it gives us the guidelines. Can we assume that the owner will come back or he won't come back? If it's spread out in 4 by 4 amos or more, it's too much work to cover that whole area to pick up 2.5 pints of grain. The owner is not likely to come back, and therefore he abandons the grain. It becomes hefker. But if it's not spread in such a big area, it's a smaller area, then the finder should assume that the owner will return and pick up the grain, and therefore it does not become hefker. Now let's see how the Gemara works out in a different way. We're now going to use a flow chart to visually get an idea of how the Gemara works. The Gemara started by quoting a statement from the Mishnah. Matza Periros Mefuzarin. If you find scattered fruit. Okay, so we know that if you find the scattered fruit, you're allowed to keep it. The Gemara then said, okay, vekama, but how much is that? It's not specifically defined by the Mishnah. How much is considered scattered? So Rabbi Yitzchak suggested that it's a kav b'arba amos. If you find 1 kav in 4 amos, that's an amount that is considered scattered. If it's in an area smaller than that, it's not scattered. So the Gemara says, but wait a second, eichidami. In what case does it make sense to use kav b'arba amos as the rule to tell us if you can keep the grain or not? And here are the two suggestions. These are the two scenarios that the Gemara mentioned. If the grain that you found, the kav b'arba amos, is derech inuach, it's placed nicely, it's neatly, then afilu betzir me'achinami. Even if it's fine, even if you find less than that amount, then you shouldn't be able to keep it, because the fact that it's inuach, that's placed, the owner intends to come back. So in a situation where the grain is thrown, it doesn't make sense to use kav b'arba amos as an indication whether you can keep the grain or not. On the other hand, iderech nefila, but if the grain looks like it was thrown there, then afilu tuvanami, even if you find more than that, you should be able to keep it because it's thrown, the owner doesn't want it. So neither of these two scenarios makes sense for this case. The case has to be a different one, and that is Amar Rav Ukba Bar Chama b'mechenasha debei dari askinan. We're talking about a case where you found leftovers of the grain in a threshing place. This is where the Mishnah says that we go by the rule of kav be'arba amos. Why do we use that rule? So here are the explanations. If you find kav be'arba amos in the threshing place, then nafish tirchayu, which is a lot of work because it's spread over a large area, lo tarachinish, we can assume that the owner, the person, will not bother himself. Velo adar ati, he will not return. Veshakelehu, to take the grain. Afkur mafkerlehu, therefore it becomes hefker, it becomes ownerless. On the other hand, betzir me'achi, if the area is smaller than 4 by 4 amos, then we should assume tarach ve'adar, he will bother to come back, ve'ati, to return, veshakelehu, and he will pick up the grain. Velo mafkerlehu, therefore it does not become hefker. So the sequence is like this. So first we determine how scattered it is. So if it's very scattered, then we can assume that there is a lot of work involved in picking it up. If there's a lot of work involved in picking it up, then the finder can figure out that the owner will return or not. If it's a lot of work, he will not return. If he will not return, then the grain is therefore ownerless, and therefore he can keep the grain. So this is the sequence of steps that the finder of grain in a threshing place will use to decide, can I keep the grain or not? So if it's kav be'arba amos, that's very scattered. There's a lot of work involved. Well, it's a lot of work involved, then the finder will not return. And if he will not return, the consequence of that is the grain becomes ownerless, and therefore he can keep the grain. So this is another way of looking at the Gemara, step by step, indented, formatted in a way that makes it clear. Matza Periros Mefuzarin, you found scattered fruit. The question was vekama, how much is considered scattered? Amar Yitzchak kav be'arba amos. Rav Yitzchak said that it's a kav in 4 amos. Then the Gemara challenged this answer. Eichedami, what exactly is the case of kav be'arba amos? Iderech nefila, if it's in a way of falling, afilu tuvanami, even a lot of grain you should be able to keep because it's thrown, the owner doesn't want it. Veiderech inuach, on the other hand, if the grain that you found was neatly placed, then afilu betzir me'achi nami lo, then even if it's very small amount of grain, the finder should not keep it because the fact that it's placed shows that he wants to return. So this is the question of eichidami. The scenarios of derech nefila, derech inuach are not the case of kav be'arba amos. Kav be'arba amos cannot be referring to a case of place or derech inuach. So now the Gemara says the final answer. Amar Ukba Bar Chama b'mechenashta debei dari askinan. The place where kav be'arba amos makes sense, the scenario for kav be'arba amos is a threshing place, the leftovers of grain that were found there. So therefore, kav be'arba amos, if what you found in the threshing place that was left over was a kav spread in arba amos, 4 by 4 amos, the nafish tirchayu, where there's a lot of work, lo tarachinish velo adar ati veshakilehu, the owner will not bother himself, he will not return and pick up the grain. Therefore, therefore, the consequence of that is the grain becomes hefker. The fact that the owner is not likely to come back makes the grain hefker, and therefore the finder can keep it. But if what you found in the leftovers of the threshing place is betzir me'achi, the area is smaller than 4 by 4 amos, then you should assume tarach ve'adar ati. You should assume that the owner will bother himself and return, v'shakilehu, to take the grain, velo mafkerlehu, and therefore it does not become. So in this unit of Gemara, we've done 2 things. First of all, we began by discussing the exact definition of Matza Periros Mefuzarin, how much is scattered, how spread out are the fruits in order to be considered scattered or not. And secondly, once we explained that it's a kav be'arba amos, the Gemara clarified in what case, in what type of circumstance, will we use the rule of Kabi Arba Amos to decide if the finder can keep it or not? Because normally what we would do is take a look. If it's placed, then the owner plans to come back. If it's thrown, the owner doesn't want it. So why do we use an amount to decide this question? It should depend on how the fruit is placed or thrown. So therefore the Gemara explained that there is a case where we cannot use the rule of placement or thrown. We have to use the amount, and that is the leftovers in a threshing place where everything is thrown, but it's thrown not because of the fact that the owner doesn't want it, is thrown because of the rushing of the owner. And therefore we have to use the rule of the amount, Kabi Arba Amos, to try to figure out in a reasonable way, is the owner likely to return or not, and that's how the finder will decide if he can keep it or not.